very soon, President Trump will sign legislation to strengthen and codify the United States sanctions against Russia. A better relationship, the lifting of sanctions, will require Russia to reverse the actions that caused the sanctions to be imposed in the first place.
That is Vice President Mike Pence, of course, in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia this morning, talking about Russian aggression and about the president, he says, signing that sanctions bill really any minute now. Our own Andrea Mitchell reporting that is likely to happen sometime in the next few days. Hasn't happened yet. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin is getting ready to shift as many as 100,000 troops right to the eastern edge of NATO territory. This is like a pre-planned drill, but it comes just a few days after Putin announced new retaliation against those sanctions, expelling, of course, hundreds of members of diplomatic staff from Moscow. Joining me now is Edward Fishman, research fellow at the Atlantic Council and former policy planning staffer at the State Department under Secretary Kerry, and Kori Schake, research fellow at the Hoover Institution and former director of defense strategy on the National Security Council under President George W. Bush. Thank you both for being here because, frankly, we have a lot to talk about this morning. And Kori, I want to start with you. This troop movement from Vladimir Putin, should we see that as an ominous threat, an ominous warning? It's something that hasn't happened in a long time.
So it's an exercise the Russians do routinely every 4 years, but they very definitely intend it to be intimidating, especially to the Baltic states. So yeah, there's reason to be nervous. The other reason to be nervous is because this kind of exercise presaged Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the America's allies in Europe are worried that the cover of the exercise might serve Russian infiltration and eventually attack on a NATO country.
So is Vice President Pence doing enough? He's on this tour. He's obviously overseas, sort of in this region, giving a big bear hug to allies over there, kind of saying, hey, we got your back a little bit. Is that enough?
It's a really good thing that he's doing that. And Secretary Tillerson has done similar. Secretary Mattis has done similar. And the United States is sending reinforcements, 800 or so paratroopers to the Baltic states, just to reassure allies. But the big problem is that the president was not reassuring to allies. And so people feel like they're getting mixed messages.
And that's the question. He still hasn't said anything publicly about the expulsion of diplomats from Moscow. He obviously is apparently, according to Vice President Pence, planning to sign that sanctions bill any day, but hasn't yet, Edward.
Yeah, it's a good point, and President Trump should sign this sanctions bill as soon as possible. It looks a little strange that on Friday night, the White House came out and said that the president would sign the bill, and now we're several days later and the bill remains unsigned. I think it's also unfortunate that President Trump has not said anything about the expulsion of 755 American employees and Russian employees from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. I don't think that this merits a response in and of itself, but the fact that the White House has been silent on this does nothing besides project weakness.
What do you think of the actual sanctions bill itself? You've called it very strong. Is it enough of a response in and of itself if the president does in fact sign it as expected?
I think it's a good start, but as with sanctions, always, it's not just about the congressional legislation, it's about how the executive branch will enforce it. So President Trump needs to enforce this sanctions bill very vigorously for it to be a strong enough response to Russia's hacking of the 2016 election.
Since you both are here, I've got to get you on another international hotspot, to say the least, which is North Korea. Senator Graham was out on the Today Show this morning talking about it, and here's what he had to say. Listen to this.
There is a military option to destroy North Korea's program and North Korea itself. If there's going to be a war to stop him, it will be over there. If thousands die, they're going to die over there. They're not going to die here.
That's obviously a strong statement from Senator Graham. There has been a lot of talk from outside experts about military action, the possibility of a first strike. It's something that I asked the press secretary about yesterday at the White House, was told, hey, we don't foreshadow our moves, but all options are on the table. Is a first strike a reality that we really are faced with here? Edward, I'll start with you.
I think it would be a very huge error for the United States to strike North Korea first. As we know, if any sort of strike on North Korea could precipitate catastrophic damage to Seoul civilian populations as well as U.S. military forces on the Korean Peninsula, I think this is an area where we should be imposing much stronger sanctions on North Korea, trying to exert economic pressure on Pyongyang and see if we can negotiate away their nuclear program, not to strike first in what would be a catastrophic risk for both U.S. people in North Korea or in South Korea as well as South Koreans themselves.
But so, Kori, does that put us back where we've been for ages now, which is relying on China to do all this?
Well, it puts us back where we've been negotiating with the North Koreans only to have them violate the agreements or over-reliance on China. I do agree with Edward that the only circumstances in which I think it would make a lot of sense to preempt the North Korean nuclear program is if we saw missiles on launch pads that they were about to launch. Otherwise, I do think that the risk to South Korean civilians in Seoul from artillery along the inter-Korean border is too high.
Before I let you go, I want to get you both on some of these reports that have come out in the last few weeks about very low morale over at the State Department among the rank and file there, concerns about budget cuts, concerns about vacancies in some crucial leadership positions. I'd like to get a sense from you of what you're hearing from folks you still know who are over there, from career folks. Kori, is there any insight you can give us as to their perspectives on this? And then, Edward, I'll go to you.
Well, I think the reports in the press are accurate. I also think it's not particularly helpful for Foreign Service officers to be complaining in the press about their leadership. I agree the reports are accurate. I also think it makes the Foreign Service look unprofessional to be doing that.
Edward?
I have to disagree with Kori there, because I think the issue here isn't so much that Foreign Service officers disagree with Trump administration policies, it's that they feel that their expertise is being disdained and that their voices aren't being heard on issues that they've worked their entire lives on. So I think it behooves Secretary Tillerson to put a little bit more faith in Foreign Service officers who've sworn oaths to the Constitution and are not political in their tasks.
Edward Fishman, Kori Schake, thank you both for being here and for your expert perspectives on all this. Much appreciated. Coming up, we're talking about Senator Jeff Flake, who himself is talking about chaos, saying it's the last thing that our allies and adversaries have to be seeing. And that's only the start of his criticism for the White House. It comes as the president's son asks, who in the party is defending my dad? We're going to take a closer look at that GOP divide after the break.